The fluorescent lights hummed above the polished floors of Naval Air Station Oceana, casting sterile white across linoleum that reflected the faces of men who'd forgotten what it meant to be surprised. Rear Admiral Marcus Highland stood in the corridor outside the briefing room, coffee in hand, watching the night shift janitor push a mop cart toward the classified wing. The woman wore the same navy blue coveralls as the rest of the cleaning crew, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her movements efficient but unremarkable. She was maybe 40, maybe older, hard to tell with people who worked the kind of jobs that aged you from the inside out. Highland had seen her around for months now, always late shift, always alone, always with that distant look in her eyes that suggested she was somewhere else entirely. His executive officer, Commander Briggs, had mentioned she was a single mother, something about her kid being homeschooled, some kind of medical situation that required constant attention. Tragic, probably, but Highland had learned long ago not to get too curious about the support staff. They kept the machine running, and the machine was all that mattered. Tonight, though, something made him speak. Maybe it was the bourbon he'd had in his office an hour earlier, or maybe it was the weight of the mission briefing he'd just endured. 12 pilots lost in the Taiwan Strait in the last 6 months, enemy radar systems evolving faster than intelligence could track them, and Washington breathing down his neck for results he couldn't manufacture. He was tired, bone tired. And when tired men see ghosts in familiar places, sometimes they reach out just to confirm they're still alive. The janitor was moving past him when Highland called out, his voice carrying that practiced authority that made junior officers straighten their spines. She stopped, turned slowly, her face neutral but her eyes, those eyes were different. They weren't the eyes of someone who cleaned floors for minimum wage. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen things break apart at 20,000 feet. "Excuse me," Highland said, stepping forward with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You prior service." It was a guess, an instinct, the kind of read you developed after 30 years in the Navy. She paused, her hand still on the mop handle, and for just a moment something flickered across her face, recognition maybe or pain. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, controlled, the kind of voice that had once spoken through radio static while missiles screamed past her canopy. Highland felt something shift in his chest, some ancient curiosity awakening. He glanced at Briggs, who was watching with mild amusement, then back at the woman. "What was your call sign?" he asked, the question half joke, half genuine. He expected something mundane, something forgettable. He didn't expect her to hesitate. He didn't expect her to look at him with those 1,000-yard stare eyes and say, very softly, "Silent Falcon, sir." The coffee cup in Highland's hand stopped halfway to his lips. Behind him, Briggs went completely still. The name hung in the air between them like a ghost ship emerging from fog, and Highland felt his blood run cold. Silent Falcon. He knew that call sign. Every pilot who'd flown combat missions in the last 20 years knew that call sign, even if they'd never met the person who carried it. It was legend, myth, the kind of story you told new aviators when you wanted to explain what real flying looked like. Silent Falcon had disappeared 11 years ago after a Black Ops mission over the South China Sea, a mission so classified that even admirals like Highland only heard whispers. The official story was that the pilot had died, aircraft lost, body never recovered, posthumous Navy Cross buried in paperwork so deep it might as well have been fiction. But here she stood, holding a mop, wearing coveralls that smelled like industrial cleaner, looking at him with eyes that had seen the curvature of the earth from altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe. Highland's throat went dry. He set the coffee cup down on a nearby desk, his hand steadier than he felt. "That's not possible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. Briggs stepped forward, his face pale. "Sir, Silent Falcon was." "I know what Silent Falcon was," Highland interrupted, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stood there with the quiet dignity of someone who'd long ago accepted that the world had moved on without her. "Captain René Vasquez," she said, supplying the name he hadn't asked for. "Retired, Honorably discharged 2014. Her voice carried no bitterness, no plea for recognition, just fact delivered with the precision of a tactical report. Highland felt the floor shift beneath him, the walls of the corridor narrowing as memory rushed back. Vasquez. He'd read the file once, years ago, back when he was still a captain himself, still hungry for stories of impossible missions and impossible pilots. She'd flown the FA-18E Super Hornet, call sign Silent Falcon, earned for her ability to approach enemy radar installations without triggering alarms, a ghost in the sky who struck before anyone knew she was there. 17 confirmed kills, 12 high-value targets eliminated, and a mission record so clean it was almost unnatural. Then she'd vanished, officially dead, unofficially forgotten, the way the Navy forgot people who became inconvenient. But why was she here? Why was she pushing a mop cart through classified corridors when she should have been teaching at Top Gun or consulting for Lockheed Martin? Highland opened his mouth to ask, but Vasquez shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "My daughter," she said quietly, answering the question he hadn't spoken. "She's 16 now. Cerebral palsy severe, needs round-the-clock care. The retirement pay didn't cover it, and contractor jobs required too much travel." This, she gestured at the mop cart, the coveralls, the empty corridor. "This lets me stay close. Night shift means I'm home during the day when she needs me." The words landed like ordnance, precise and devastating, and Highland felt something crack inside his chest. This woman, this legend who'd flown into hell and back without blinking, had traded her wings for a mop because the system she'd served had left her behind. It was obscene. It was unforgivable. It was exactly the kind of thing that happened every day to people who didn't have admirals watching. Briggs cleared his throat, uncomfortable, but Highland silenced him with a glance. "Captain Vasquez," he said, the rank slipping naturally from his lips despite her civilian status, "I need to speak with you. Not here, somewhere private. Tomorrow morning, 800, my office." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something, sincerity maybe or ulterior motive. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, sir," she said, and turned back to her mop cart. Highland watched her walk away, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the wet floor, and felt the weight of something enormous settling onto his shoulders. Silent Falcon wasn't dead. Silent Falcon was cleaning floors. And if the rumors he'd heard in that briefing room were true, if the mission they were planning was as impossible as it sounded, then maybe, just maybe, the Navy was about to need a ghost. That night Highland couldn't sleep. He sat in his study at home, the one his ex-wife had always complained was too cluttered with memorabilia, and pulled up classified files on his secure laptop. Vasquez, Rene Maria, born in San Antonio, Texas, 1984. Joined the Navy at 18, Naval Academy graduate with honors, flight school at Pensacola where she'd broken every record they had for simulator scores. Her first squadron assignment was to VFA 154, the Black Knights, flying F/A-18CS off the USS Kitty Hawk during the early days of the War on Terror. By 25, she was already a combat veteran with more carrier landings than pilots twice her age. But it was the Black Ops assignments that made her legend. Between 2009 and 2014, Vasquez had flown missions that officially didn't exist. Deep penetration strikes into denied airspace, reconnaissance flights over hostile territory where a single mistake meant death or worse, and surgical eliminations of targets that the State Department swore America wasn't targeting. Her call sign, Silent Falcon, came from a mission in 2011 when she'd flown an FA-18E so low over the Persian Gulf that Iranian radar literally couldn't distinguish her from the sea clutter. She destroyed 3 mobile SAM sites before they even knew she was there, then vanished back into the night like a myth. Pilots who flew with her said she had instincts that bordered on supernatural, an ability to read airspace the way chess masters read boards, 3 moves ahead always. Then came 2014 and the mission that ended everything. The file was redacted to hell, black bars covering names and locations, but Highland could read between the lines. Vasquez had been part of a 3-aircraft strike package sent to neutralize a Chinese intelligence station on an artificial island in the Spratly chain. The mission went sideways fast. Ambush, Sam trap, one pilot killed, another captured. Vasquez had stayed on station alone, drawing fire while the remaining aircraft escaped, then somehow made it back to the carrier on fumes and prayers. She'd been recommended for the Medal of Honor. Instead, she got a Navy Cross buried in a classified filing cabinet and a medical discharge 6 months later for psychological unsuitability. The official reason was PTSD, but Highland knew the real story. She'd refused to lie in the after-action report, had insisted on telling the truth about command failures that led to the ambush, and the Navy had repaid her honesty by pushing her out. Her daughter had been born 3 months later, premature, complications, the father nowhere in the file. Vasquez had taken her retirement pay and disappeared into the civilian world, resurfacing 11 years later as a janitor on the base where she'd once been worshipped. Highland closed the laptop and stared at the wall, at the photos of his own career. Ceremonies, handshakes, medals that suddenly felt cheap. The next morning, Vasquez arrived at Highland's office exactly at 800, still wearing her coveralls but carrying herself with a posture that no amount of menial labor could erase. She stood at attention in front of his desk, eyes forward, waiting. Highland gestured to a chair. "Sit, please. This isn't that kind of meeting." She sat, hands folded in her lap, expression neutral. Highland leaned back, studying her. In the morning light streaming through the window, he could see the lines around her eyes, the silver threading through her dark hair, the calluses on her hands from years of work that had nothing to do with throttles and stick grips. But he could also see the pilot underneath, the one who defied physics and enemy fire, the one who'd earned a legend. "I read your file last night," he said. "The unredacted parts, anyway." She didn't react, didn't even blink. "Then you know why I'm here, sir." "I know you got screwed," Highland said bluntly. "I know the Navy failed you. I know you sacrificed everything and got nothing in return." Now she did react, a slight tightening around her mouth. "With respect, Admiral, I didn't come here for an apology if there's nothing else." "There is something else," Highland interrupted. He pulled a folder from his desk drawer, unmarked, and slid it across to her. "I have a mission. It's bad. 12 pilots already dead bad." Vasquez's eyes dropped to the folder, but she didn't touch it. "I'm not a pilot anymore, sir. I'm a janitor with a disabled daughter who needs me." "I know," Highland said, "and I wouldn't ask if there was anyone else who could do this. But there isn't. You're the only pilot alive who successfully penetrated Chinese air defense networks and made it out. You're the only one who understands how they think, how they operate. I need your expertise even if you never fly again. I need Silent Falcon." The call sign seemed to echo in the office, and for the first time Vasquez's composure cracked. She looked away, jaw tight, and Highland saw the pain there, the loss, the longing, the part of her that still dreamed in altitudes and airspeeds. "My daughter," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't leave her." "You won't have to," Highland said. "This base has medical facilities. I can arrange full-time care, the best doctors, whatever she needs. And you won't be flying combat, just consulting, planning, helping us not get more pilots killed. Please, Captain, I need you." Vasquez closed her eyes, and Highland watched a lifetime of decisions play out across her face. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The janitor was gone, and the pilot was staring back at him. The briefing room was packed when Vasquez walked in 3 days later, and the reaction was immediate. 12 pilots, all men, all Top Gun graduates, all convinced they were the best the Navy had to offer, and all suddenly confronted with a woman in a flight suit that looked like it had been pulled from storage, the name tape reading VASQUEZ in faded letters. The whispers started instantly. "Who's that? Some relic from the old days. Why is she even here?" Highland stood at the front, waiting, and when the room finally quieted, he spoke with the authority of a man who'd lost patience with fools. "Gentlemen, this is Captain Renee Vasquez, call sign Silent Falcon. She's going to be your mission planner for Operation Ghost Wire. You will treat her with respect. You will listen to everything she says, and you will follow her recommendations without question. Is that clear?" The room was silent, but Highland could see the skepticism, the dismissal, the way these young pilots looked at Vasquez and saw nothing but an old woman who couldn't possibly understand modern warfare. One pilot, Lieutenant Danny Graves, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "With respect, sir, I've never heard of Silent Falcon. What makes her qualified to plan a mission for us?" Highland's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Vasquez stepped forward. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who didn't need to prove anything. "Lieutenant Graves, in 2011, I flew an FA-18E Super Hornet at wave-top level across the Persian Gulf, evaded Iranian air defense networks that are now considered primitive compared to what you'll face, and destroyed 3 SAM sites before they could broadcast my position. In 2013, I penetrated Chinese airspace over the Parasols and eliminated a signals intelligence station that was tracking carrier movements in the South China Sea. I did this without support, without backup, and without anyone on this planet knowing I was there until the explosion started. The mission you're about to fly, I've already flown it, I survived it, 12 pilots before you didn't, so yes, Lieutenant, I'm qualified." The room was dead silent. Graves had gone pale, his smirk evaporating like fuel vapor. Another pilot, older with silver at his temples, leaned forward. "Captain Vasquez, Commander Jake Mercer, VFA 213. I've heard the stories, ma'am. I thought you were. I mean, we all thought." "Dead," Vasquez supplied, her expression unchanging. "I was for 11 years, now I'm not. Let's move on." Highland watched the pilots' faces change, skepticism melting into something like awe, and he allowed himself a small, private smile. Silent Falcon was back, and hell was about to remember why it had feared her in the first place. The mission was insane. Highland knew it, Vasquez knew it, and the 12 pilots sitting in that briefing room were beginning to understand it as the tactical display lit up with red enemy positions like a constellation of death. Operation Ghost Wire called for a 4-aircraft strike package to penetrate Chinese airspace near the Spratly Islands, disable a new S-400 air defense installation that was threatening carrier operations, and extract before the entire People's Liberation Army Navy descended on them. The problem was simple. The S-400 had engagement ranges exceeding 200 miles, radar that could track stealth aircraft, and was supported by J-20 fighters, China's answer to the F-22 Raptor. Every simulation had ended in catastrophic losses. Every plan had resulted in dead pilots. And Washington was demanding results anyway because politics didn't care about physics. Vasquez stood at the tactical display, her hands moving across the holographic interface with practiced ease, and Highland was struck by how naturally she inhabited this space. No longer the janitor, no longer the forgotten veteran, but the warrior she'd always been underneath. "The S-400's weakness isn't its hardware," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "It's its doctrine. Chinese air defense networks are brilliant, but they're also rigid. They rely on overlapping coverage, redundancy, coordination. Break one link, the whole chain hesitates." "How do you break the link?" Mercer asked, leaning forward, genuinely interested now. Vasquez zoomed in on the display, highlighting a narrow corridor between radar coverage zones. "Here, 20-mile gap between the S-400's primary radar and its auxiliary station. It exists for exactly 40 seconds every 3 hours when they rotate shifts and recalibrate systems. You fly through that gap at wave-top level, electromagnetic silence, no radar, no radio, nothing but eyes and instinct. You'll have one shot at the target before they realize you're there." Graves spoke up, his earlier arrogance replaced by doubt. "Ma'am, that corridor is 15 miles wide at best, at wave-top level in Super Hornets with no electronic guidance. That's a needle through a needle's eye." Vasquez turned to him and her expression was hard. "Yes, Lieutenant, it is. Which is why most of you won't make it." The room erupted. Pilots shouted objections, questions, disbelief. Highland raised a hand for silence, but Vasquez was already speaking, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos without rising in volume. "Listen to me. You're all excellent pilots, Top Gun graduates, combat veterans, the best the Navy has. But this mission isn't about being excellent. It's about being willing to die. Her words hit like ordnance and the room fell silent. Vasquez continued, her eyes moving from face to face, measuring, judging. The Chinese aren't idiots. They know we're coming. They've been waiting for this moment since the first carrier entered the South China Sea. That corridor I showed you, it's not a flaw, it's a trap. They leave it open because they want us to take it. They want us to think we're clever. And when we commit, when we're deep in that corridor with nowhere to go but forward, they'll close it behind us and kill us all. She paused, letting the words sink in. Unless we're faster than their kill chain. Unless we're so precise, so perfect that we're through the target and gone before they can react. That's the only way this works. Not skill, not technology, speed and timing and the willingness to fly into hell without blinking. Graves spoke again, quieter now. You did this. You flew missions like this and survived. Vasquez nodded slowly. I did. 17 times, and every time I thought it would be the last. Every time I said goodbye to everything I loved before I climbed into that cockpit. That's the difference between pilots who survive these missions and pilots who don't, knowing you're already dead and flying anyway. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, and Highland saw something change in the pilots' faces. Over the next week, Vasquez drove the pilots harder than they'd ever been driven. She ran simulations 20 hours a day, breaking only for meals and brief rest periods that left everyone exhausted and irritable. She critiqued every maneuver, every decision, every radio call with a precision that bordered on cruelty. When Lieutenant Graves tried to improvise during a simulation, pulling up early to avoid simulated ground fire, Vasquez stopped the exercise and made him run it again, 12 times, until he could fly the exact profile she'd outlined without deviation. In combat, creativity gets you killed, she told him after the 12th run, her voice flat. You fly the plan. You trust the plan. The moment you start thinking you're smarter than the plan, you're dead. Graves looked at her with something between respect and fear. How do you turn off your brain like that? How do you stop second-guessing? Vasquez was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. You don't turn it off. You just accept that the voice in your head saying you're going to die is probably right and you fly anyway. The other pilots watched this exchange, and Highland saw the transformation happening. These cocky, self-assured aviators were being forged into something harder, something deadlier. Silent Falcon wasn't teaching them to fly. She was teaching them to survive. But it wasn't all brutality. Late one night, Highland found Vasquez in the hangar, standing beneath an FA-18E Super Hornet, her hand resting on the landing gear like she was touching something sacred. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but she spoke without turning. I used to dream about flying, she said softly. Even after I left, even after everything. I'd wake up and feel like I was falling, like I'd forgotten how to breathe without the mask, how to think without the HUD feeding me information. My daughter would be crying, needing me, and all I could think about was the sky. Highland stood beside her, looking up at the aircraft. Do you regret it, leaving? Vasquez laughed, a short, bitter sound. Every day and never. I gave up everything for her, my career, my identity, my purpose. But she's alive because I did. She's 16 and she's smart and she's kind and she exists because I chose her over this. She gestured at the Hornet. That's not a regret. That's a trade I'd make 1,000 times over. But you miss it, Highland said. It wasn't a question. I miss who I was when I flew, Vasquez admitted. I miss feeling like I mattered, like I was part of something bigger than myself. I miss the simplicity of combat. You're alive or you're dead and everything else is just noise. Highland heard the longing in her voice, the grief for a life that had been taken from her not by enemies but by the very institution she'd served. If you could fly this mission, he asked carefully, would you? Vasquez turned to him, and in the dim hangar lights he saw the truth written across her face. In a heartbeat, she whispered. Even knowing I might not come back, even knowing my daughter needs me. There's a part of me that's still up there, Admiral, and it's been dying slowly for 11 years. This mission. It would kill me or save me. Either way, it would be an ending. Highland felt something break inside him, some wall he'd built between duty and humanity. I can't ask you to fly it, he said. I won't, but I can give you something else. He pulled a small box from his pocket, flipped it open to reveal a pair of pilot's wings, not the standard Navy issue, but a custom set, silver and gold, with a falcon engraved in the center. "These were made for you 11 years ago," Highland said. "After the mission that ended your career. The Medal of Honor recommendation got buried, but there were people who wanted you to know you mattered. These wings, they're from your squadron. They had them made before you left, but you disappeared before they could give them to you." Vasquez stared at the wings, her composure finally shattering. Tears ran down her face, silent and unstoppable, and she reached out with trembling hands to touch the medal. "I thought everyone had forgotten," she whispered. "I thought I was just another casualty, another name in a file." "Never," Highland said firmly. "Silent Falcon is legend, Captain, and legends don't die, they just wait for the right moment to return." Vasquez took the wings, held them against her chest, and for a long moment she just stood there, crying in the shadows of the hangar while the ghosts of her past circled overhead. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clear, determined. "Then let's make sure these pilots don't become legends," she said. "Let's make sure they come home." The mission was set for 72 hours later, and the final briefing had the weight of a funeral service. The 4 pilots selected for the strike package sat in the front row: Mercer, Graves, and 2 others, Lieutenants Sophia Torres and Marcus Webb, all volunteers, all knowing the odds. Vasquez walked them through the plan one last time, her voice steady, clinical, but Highland could see the emotion underneath, the way her hands trembled slightly when she pointed at the corridor they'd fly through. "Radio silence until weapons release," she said. "Torres, your lead. Mercer, you're her wingman. Graves and Webb, you're the second element. Stay tight, stay low, and do not deviate from the flight path. The moment you light up radar, you're dead. The moment you transmit, you're dead. You fly dark and fast, and you trust that the math is right." Torres raised her hand. "Captain, what if the corridor closes early? What if they've changed their rotation schedule?" Vasquez met her eyes, and Highland saw the understanding pass between them. 2 women in a profession dominated by men, 2 warriors who'd learned to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. "Then you punch through anyway," Vasquez said. "You go full afterburner, you accept that you're burned, and you complete the mission before they kill you. No bailouts, no surrender, you finish the job." Torres nodded slowly, accepting the death sentence with a calm that made Highland's chest ache. "Understood, ma'am." The briefing ended and the pilots filed out to their aircraft. Vasquez stood alone at the front of the room, staring at the tactical display, and Highland approached her. "You did everything you could," he said gently. "Whatever happens now, it's on me." Vasquez shook her head. "No, sir, it's on me. I sent them into that corridor." The strike package launched at 304 Super Hornets, catapulting off the carrier deck into darkness absolute. Highland and Vasquez watched from the operations center, surrounded by screens showing aircraft telemetry, radar feeds, and satellite imagery. The Hornets flew south, low over black water, their engines whispering against the night. Vasquez stood rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the console, and Highland saw her lips moving, counting seconds, calculating distances, flying the mission in her mind alongside the pilots she'd trained. 20 minutes in, Tor's voice crackled over the radio, calm and professional. "Strike package approaching waypoint Alpha. Going dark." The telemetry feeds blinked out as the aircraft entered electromagnetic silence. Now they were ghosts, invisible to satellite, invisible to radar, 4 specks of metal and human while streaking toward death at 600 miles per hour. Vasquez closed her eyes, and Highland heard her whisper, "Fly true, Silent Falcons, fly true." The minutes stretched into eternity. The operations center was silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of someone's nervous breathing. Highland watched the mission clock tick forward, 28 minutes, 29:30. The corridor should be opening now, the brief window between Chinese radar sweeps. 32 minutes, 33. Vasquez's eyes were still closed, her face pale. "Come on," she murmured. "Come on, come on." 35 minutes. The moment the weapons should release, the moment the S-400 installation should be vaporized by precision-guided ordnance. Still nothing. No signal, no confirmation, just silence. Then at 36 minutes, Tor's voice burst through the speakers, sharp and clear. Rifle, 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 birds away, strike package egressing. The operations center erupted in cheers, but Vasquez didn't move, didn't celebrate. She was still counting, still flying the mission in her head. "They're not out yet," she said quietly. "The corridor closes in 90 seconds. They need to be clear before." An alarm shrieked across the operations center. Radar contacts, multiple, converging on the strike package's last known position. J-20 fighters scrambled from mainland China, burning toward the Spratly Islands at supersonic speed. Highland's blood went cold. "They're burned," someone said. "The Chinese made them. They're going to get intercepted." Vasquez's eyes snapped open and she grabbed the radio handset, keying the emergency frequency. "Tors, this is Silent Falcon. You have J-20s inbound, bearing 095 Angels 25. Break left, go defensive, get below their radar floor." There was a pause, then Tor's voice, strained but controlled. "Copy, Silent Falcon, breaking left, going defensive." On the screens, the telemetry flickered back online. The Hornets had lit up their radars, abandoning stealth for speed. Highland watched the 4 aircraft symbols race west, pursued by 8 red contacts moving impossibly fast. The math was simple. The Chinese fighters were faster, had more fuel, and would catch the Hornets before they reached the carrier's protective SAM envelope. "They're not going to make it," Briggs said, his voice hollow. Vasquez grabbed Highland's arm, her grip iron-strong. "Sir, I need an aircraft, now." Highland stared at her. "What?" "I can buy them time," Vasquez said, her voice urgent. "Give me a Hornet, let me launch. I can pull the J-20s off their tail. I know their tactics, I know how they think. I can save them." "You haven't flown combat in 11 years, Highland said, even as his mind raced through possibilities. "You're not current, you're not cleared." "I'm Silent Falcon," Vasquez interrupted, and her eyes blazed with something terrible and beautiful. "I've been ready for this my entire life. Let me fly, Admiral. Let me save them." Highland looked at the screens, at the 4 pilots racing toward death, and made a decision that would either save them or haunt him forever. "Launch crew, prep a Super Hornet immediately. Captain Vasquez is flying." The operations center fell silent, shocked, but the order was already in motion. Vasquez was running before Highland finished speaking, sprinting toward the flight deck with a speed that defied her years. She hit the ready room, grabbed a flight suit that someone thrust at her, and was dressed and moving in under 90 seconds. The crew chiefs on deck stared as she climbed into the cockpit of an FA-18E, her hands moving through the startup checklist with muscle memory that hadn't faded despite a decade away. The engines spooled to life, howling their readiness, and Vasquez felt something unlock inside her, a door opening, a prisoner freed, Silent Falcon waking from a long sleep. "Tower, this is Silent Falcon, ready for launch," she said, her voice steady over the radio. There was a pause, then the air boss's voice, reverent. "Silent Falcon, you are cleared for launch. Give him hell, ma'am." The catapult hurled her into darkness, and suddenly she was flying again, the ocean a black void below, the stars a distant ceiling above. Vasquez pushed the throttles forward, felt the Hornet surge beneath her, and smiled, a fierce, predatory smile that belonged to someone who'd been waiting 11 years for this moment. She climbed to 20,000 feet, activated her radar, and immediately saw them, the strike package fleeing west, the J-20s closing from behind like wolves on wounded prey. Vasquez calculated angles, distances, closure rates, and keyed her radio. "Tors, this is Silent Falcon. I'm inbound, Angels 20, you're 6 o'clock. When I merge with the J-20s, you break hard right and run for the boat. Do not look back. Do not engage, just run." "Silent Falcon, you're 1 aircraft against 8, Tors protested. "You can't." "I'm not asking for permission, Lieutenant," Vasquez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd flown into hell before. "I'm giving you an order. When I tell you to break, you break, understand?" There was a pause, then, "Yes, ma'am, good hunting." Vasquez pushed the Hornet faster, the airframe shuddering as she accelerated past Mach 1.2. The J-20s were visible now on her HUD, 8 red diamonds arrayed in a perfect tactical formation. They hadn't seen her yet. She was behind them, below their radar scan, a ghost closing in from the darkness. At 5 miles, she armed her missiles. At 3 miles, she locked onto the trailing J-20. At 1 mile, she whispered, "Weapons free." The AIM-120 AMRAAM leapt from her wing, a streak of white fire that crossed the distance in seconds and detonated against the J-20's tail section, shredding control surfaces and sending the Chinese fighter into a tumbling death spiral. The other J-20s scattered, their formation breaking as they realized they were under attack from behind. Vasquez was already turning, already repositioning, her hands and feet working the controls with a precision that hadn't degraded despite the years. She fired again, another AMRAAM, another J-20 damaged and falling away. The remaining 6 fighters abandoned the chase, turning to face her, and Vasquez keyed her radio one last time. "Tours, break right, go, now!" The strike package peeled away, racing for the carrier, and Vasquez was alone with 6 of China's most advanced fighters, all of them focused on killing her. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt alive, more alive than she'd been in 11 years. "Come on, then," she whispered, and dove toward the ocean, pulling the J-20s down with her into the darkness where she'd always been most dangerous. The dogfight that followed would be analyzed for years, studied at every military academy, dissected by historians and tacticians who'd never understand what it felt like to be there. Vasquez flew like a woman possessed, using every trick she'd learned in 17 years of combat flying. High-G turns that should have torn the Hornet apart, jinking maneuvers that defeated missile locks, rolls and dives and climbs that pushed the aircraft beyond its design limits. The J-20s were faster, more maneuverable, more advanced, but they were flown by pilots who trained in simulators, who'd never felt the terror of real combat, who'd never learned that survival wasn't about technology but about will. Vasquez shot down 2 more, her gun rounds walking across canopies and engines, then evaded a missile so close it scorched her tail section. 3 J-20s left now, circling, cautious, realizing they'd underestimated the ghost they were hunting. She was out of missiles, low on fuel, her aircraft damaged and her body screaming from the sustained G-forces. But she was also Silent Falcon, and Silent Falcon didn't quit. She turned into the remaining fighters, charged directly at them, and watched them break formation, not from skill but from fear. They scattered, climbing away, and Vasquez let them go, turning west toward the carrier that was waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Her radio crackled. "Silent Falcon, this is Overlord. Strike package is safely recovered. You are cleared to return home." Home. The word felt foreign, impossible. She flew west through the darkness, her damaged Hornet shuddering with every mile, fuel gauge dropping toward 0. The carrier appeared on her radar, a tiny beacon of safety in an ocean of black, and Vasquez lined up for the approach, her hands steady on the controls despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. The landing was textbook, wire 3, exactly where it should be. Hornet's tailhook caught the arresting cable and hurled her forward against the straps. Then everything was still except for the howl of wind and the thunder of her heart. The canopy opened, and Vasquez climbed out onto the deck, her legs nearly buckling as gravity reasserted itself. Around her, the flight deck crew stood in silence. Then someone started clapping, slow, steady applause that spread across the deck until every sailor, every pilot, every person who'd witnessed what she'd done was cheering. Highland was there, his face streaked with tears he didn't bother to hide. "You magnificent, crazy, brilliant woman," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt like absolution. "You saved them. You saved all of them." Vasquez didn't speak, couldn't speak. She just stood there on the deck of the carrier, feeling the wind and the noise and the weight of what she'd done. The strike package pilots found her in the ready room an hour later, still in her flight suit, staring at nothing. Torres approached first, her young face serious, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. You gave up everything to save us." "Why?" Vasquez looked at her, at these 4 pilots who'd flown into hell because she'd asked them to, and felt something shift inside her, the last piece of Silent Falcon clicking back into place. "Because I remember what it's like to be you," she said quietly. "I remember flying missions that should have killed me, coming back against impossible odds and wondering if anyone cared. I remember thinking I was expendable, that my life didn't matter as long as the mission succeeded. And I swore if I ever had the chance to tell a pilot they mattered more than the mission, I'd take it. You mattered, Lieutenant Tors. All of you mattered. And I'd fly into hell 1,000 times to prove it. Tors nodded, tears streaming down her face, and the other pilots gathered around, Mercer, Graves, Webb, all of them silent, all of them understanding that they'd witnessed something rare and precious. Vasquez stood, straightened her flight suit, and looked at each of them in turn. Now go get some rest. And tomorrow we debrief everything that went wrong. The investigation into Vasquez's unauthorized launch was brief and perfunctory. Highland took full responsibility, claimed he'd ordered it, and dared the Pentagon to court-martial him for saving 4 pilots. They didn't. Instead, they quietly promoted Vasquez to commander, reinstated her active duty status, and assigned her to develop a new training program for deep penetration strike missions. The story of Silent Falcon's return spread through the Navy like wildfire. Pilots who'd never heard the name before suddenly knew it, and those who'd thought it was myth realized it was history. Vasquez became a symbol, not just of skill or bravery, but of something deeper. The idea that you could lose everything and still matter, that the system could fail you and you could still choose to serve. She moved her daughter to base housing, arranged for the medical care that had been promised, and returned to flying, not as a janitor who'd once been a pilot, but as Silent Falcon, legend and warrior, teaching the next generation how to survive the impossible. One evening, 6 months later, Highland found her in the hangar again, standing beneath the same FA-18E she'd flown that night. The Hornet's tail still bore scorch marks from the missile that had nearly killed her, and the crew chiefs had refused to repair them. Some wounds were worth keeping. "Was your daughter?" Highland asked, joining her. "Improving," Vasquez said, and her smile was genuine, unguarded. "The new therapists are incredible. She's starting to walk with assistance. Says she wants to be a pilot like her mom." Highland laughed, shaking his head. "Heaven help us if she inherits your instincts." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the hangar crew prep aircraft for the next day's operations, and Highland felt the weight of the question he'd been carrying for months. "Do you regret it?" "Coming back," Vasquez considered this, her eyes distant. "I regret the years I lost. I regret that it took 12 dead pilots and a suicide mission for the Navy to remember I existed. But regret this," she gestured at the aircraft, at the flight deck beyond, at the vast sky that stretched overhead. "No, I was always going to come back. I was always Silent Falcon, even when I was pushing a mop. The only difference is now everyone else knows it too." Highland nodded, understanding. "So what's next? You going to stay until they force you out again?" Vasquez turned to him, and her expression was fierce, determined. "I'm going to stay until every pilot in this Navy knows they matter more than the mission. I'm going to teach them that survival isn't about being the best, it's about refusing to quit. And I'm going to make sure that when they look up and see the sky, they remember that Silent Falcon flew there first and she came back. So can they?" She paused, then added, "And then maybe I'll retire for real. Buy a little house somewhere quiet, teach my daughter to fly, write a book about all the missions that officially never happened, live the life I earned." Highland smiled, feeling something like hope. "Sounds perfect, Commander. Sounds like a good ending." Vasquez laughed, short and sharp. "Endings are overrated, Admiral. I prefer beginnings." She walked away then, leaving Highland alone in the hangar with his thoughts and the ghosts of pilots who'd flown before. Above them, through the open hangar doors, the stars wheeled slowly across an infinite sky, cold, distant, and full of possibility. Somewhere in that darkness, Silent Falcon still flew, eternal and unconquerable, a legend that had become real and then legend again. And somewhere on a carrier deck in the South China Sea, a single father janitor with a call sign everyone had forgotten was being remembered, honored, and given back the wings she'd earned with blood and sacrifice. The story should have ended there, with triumph and redemption and a future full of promise. But stories like this don't end. They echo, ripple outward, touch lives in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. 3 years after Operation Ghost Wire, a young ensign named Jamie Chen, no relation to any Chen in previous paragraphs, arrived at Naval Air Station Oceana for flight training. She was nervous, uncertain, plagued by the same doubts that haunted every new pilot. She'd heard the rumors about the legendary Silent Falcon, the instructor who could break you or make you, depending on whether you had the heart to survive her training. On her first day, Chen was called to Commander Vasquez's office, a small space filled with photos of aircraft and pilots, a single Navy cross mounted on the wall, and a pair of silver wings with a falcon engraved in the center. Vasquez looked up from her paperwork, studied Chen for a long moment, then smiled. "You look terrified, Ensign." "Good, fear means you're smart enough to know what you're getting into." Chen swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I'm honored to train under you. I've heard the stories. I want to be like you." Vasquez's smile faded and she stood, walked around the desk, and faced Chen with an intensity that made the young ensign want to step back. "No, Ensign, you don't want to be like me. You want to be better than me. You want to learn from my mistakes, avoid my tragedies, and fly higher than I ever could. That's what it means to be a pilot, not to copy those who came before, but to exceed them. Can you do that?" Chen hesitated, then nodded. "I can try, ma'am." "Trying isn't good enough," Vasquez said. "You either commit or you quit. There's no middle ground in the sky, so I'll ask you again, can you do that?" Chen met her instructor's eyes, saw the steel there, the fire that had burned through impossible missions and impossible odds, and felt something harden inside herself. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." Vasquez smiled again, this time with approval. "Good, then let's begin." They walked to the flight line together, instructor and student, legend and legacy, and somewhere overhead the sky waited, vast, indifferent, and full of endless possibility. Because that's what Silent Falcon had proven in the end, that the sky didn't care who you were or where you came from or how many times the world had tried to break you. The sky only cared whether you had the courage to fly. And courage, Vasquez had learned, wasn't something you were born with. It was something you chose, every day, every mission, every moment when the voice in your head said you couldn't. Years would pass. Chen would graduate, earn her wings, fly her own impossible missions. Other students would follow, each carrying a piece of Silent Falcon's legacy forward into futures unknown. Vasquez would eventually retire, really retire this time, and spend her days teaching her daughter to fly, writing her book, living the quiet life she'd earned. But on clear nights when the stars were bright and the wind carried the distant sound of jet engines, she'd step outside and look up, remembering what it felt like to touch the edge of heaven. Her daughter, now 20, would join her sometimes, standing on legs that had learned to walk through sheer determination, and ask the question she'd asked 100 times before. "Mom, what was it like? Really like?" And Vasquez would smile, put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and say what she always said. "It was like being alive, sweetheart, just intensely, impossibly, beautifully alive." They'd stand there together, mother and daughter, warrior and miracle, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient dance. And somewhere in that infinite darkness, Silent Falcon still flew, not as memory or legend, but as truth, eternal and unchanging, a reminder that the human spirit could endure anything if it refused to surrender. The night wind carried their whispers away, scattered them across the vast expanse of earth and sky, and the world continued turning, indifferent, eternal, and full of stories waiting to be told. This was one of them. Not the end, because stories like this never end. Just a pause, a breath, a moment of stillness before the next mission, the next challenge, the next impossible dream that someone somewhere would dare to pursue. Because that's what Silent Falcon had taught them all, that impossible was just another word for not yet, that legends were just people who refused to quit, and that sometimes the janitor pushing a mop through classified corridors was actually the most dangerous pilot alive, waiting for the moment when the world needed her to remember how to fly. That moment had come. She'd answered the call, and the sky, which had never forgotten her, welcomed her home with open arms and endless horizons. This was her story. This was their story. This was the story of everyone who'd ever looked up at the stars and dared to dream of touching them. And it would echo through time, carried on the wings of those who came after until the end of days and beyond. Silent Falcon, always flying, never forgotten.